What I will do today is present you the first learnings of our practice with aid organizations when it comes to carbon footprint reduction, and notably how to halve an aid organization's footprint by 2030. And the purpose really is to share a first few key lessons from the work we're doing and for the humanitarian sector. Now, as a reminder, why is this critical? It's because, as you all know, we're confronted with an acceleration of global warming, which is going to show its impact more and more evidently in the years to come, and with a trajectory which is leading us probably beyond 3 degrees today if nothing changes. And the whole point is how every actor in society can contribute to the trajectory below, which is stabilizing climate through rapid transformation of organizational practices at all levels in society. Now, who are we? I'll just give a little information on what is the Climate Action Accelerator. It's a non-for-profit initiative. It was created about 18 months ago and based in Geneva. And its aim is to mobilize a critical mass of community organizations to scale up climate solutions and contribute to the stabilization we're all looking for, with a specific focus on the aid, health, and higher education sectors. And here we will focus on the international aid sector, which is the first one we've actually mobilized. But we're about also to develop activities with health actors in different societies. And the whole purpose is basically how to reach a radical transformation and reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 along what is a net zero trajectory in line with the Paris Agreement. Now, we have 3 key objectives in the Accelerator initiative. It's first, empowering organization, basically how to move from intentions to action and to results, and to halve emissions. So this is through a network of support resources, expertise, sharing of knowledge, and practically working on action plans and roadmaps. The second objective is how to work with the same partner organizations to contribute to a domino effect within their networks with peers to basically have an influence sector-wide. And third, it's to build a community of practice, open source, sharing solutions, experience, tools with everybody, whether they're partners or not of the Climate Action Accelerator. Now, as I said before, the first sector we have been focusing on over last year and this year is international aid. Half of the organizations on board currently are also active in the health area, so they're medical aid organizations with quite a big synergy between the two. And we're currently in discussion with health institutions to join the community. And we will be addressing also key university or research institutions also to join this movement. Now, in practice, who are our partners? So today, as of today, we have 15 aid organizations that have joined the Accelerator. They've committed to very clear reduction targets, so minus 50% by 2030. And we've started working with each of them on their action plans. But we had a laboratory, an initial laboratory in 2021, which was with one of these NGOs ALIMA, the International Medical Alliance. And as you see, on board is also the International Committee of the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, the Terre des Hommes movement, and several other organizations like Drugs for Neglected Diseases, Nonviolent Peace Force, etc. And we're also an official partner of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, notably through the Race to Zero campaign, which aims at mobilizing different sectors of society towards this global resilient to global race to a resilient net zero future. Now, what we've done over the past few months is, with our partners, work through a methodology and a number of practical steps to build action plans and roadmaps. And we think it's the right moment to start sharing with you, with the community, a number of lessons that can be learned from these processes. One, as I said, is fulfilled with ALIMA. We're already in the implementation phase. And with ICRC, MSF, Terre des Hommes, we're in the process of building these roadmaps. And there's a second wave of organizations with whom we're about to start the work at mid-year. And we hope to reach around 25 organizations on board of the initiative by the end of the year. Now, coming back to ALIMA and what the first lessons from the building of a climate and environmental roadmap. So ALIMA is an NGO, a medical humanitarian NGO based in Dakar and Paris. They have more or less a 60 million euro budget. They're present mainly in Western and Central Africa. And they have relatively large operations, hospitals, nutritional projects, and about close to 3,000 staff in the field. Now, we worked over a period of about 9 months intensively with them in 2021 and defined a number of essential principles that we thought were key in the building of such a roadmap. So first, a principle of integrity and determination, because the issue is clearly to have an impact in the radical transformation of organizational practices. So the target is extremely important, minus 50% by 2030, but achieving this also without compensation. So what we're talking about is absolute reduction pathways and not basically buying carbon credits to integrate this into calculations. It's also a principle of humility, because it is a process of continuous learning. There are areas where there's accumulated experience, existing lessons from other sectors, etc. And there are areas where the work is in front of us, and it's also about confronting the ways of how to address the problem in practice, and also learning by doing. Finally, two other important principles. So mobilizing resources to make it happen. This is not about just a book of intentions. It's about actually planning the resources, human, technical, financial, to implement the projects behind. And last but not least, it is about how to reduce radically the footprint of a humanitarian organization while not affecting its core goal of assistance of vulnerable populations. So it is a red line. And I would say that the whole challenge is basically how to comfort the mission of aid organizations while decoupling the emission of carbon emissions from the development of their activities. That's the central challenge. We defined together a methodology of basically building roadmaps with different phases. And without going into details, this is very much a process that we go through with all our other partner organizations. So we're building about 10 roadmaps currently throughout the year in 2022. So it means going through a state of affairs. It means a participative process where people can contribute to the selection of solutions and actions. It means going through impact and feasibility assessment, and then the setting of objectives and targets, and especially modelizing a trajectory, and then going towards indicators and of course a narrative. This is not only about carbon footprint, it's also about a more comprehensive approach to environmental impact. But here, for the sake of this presentation, I'll concentrate mainly on the carbon footprint part. Okay. So what do we see in the footprint of an aid organization? And this is the example of Halima in 2019, so pre-COVID. Well, we see that emissions are usually very concentrated in a few big sources of emission. And what are these big sources of emission? It's a lot around procurement of goods and services. That's the yellow part, almost 40%. And then you have the green part, which is also around 40%, which is all that's transport related, both travel and freight. And finally, in blue, you're going to have the emissions related to notably the energy that is used for buildings and equipment, basically in buildings, and where obviously fossil fuels are predominant. So what's interesting here is that these three sources make more than 97% of the footprint of the organization, and humanitarian aid organizations have the footprint of, I would say, equivalent companies of the same size, so at least service companies of the same size. So it is relatively significant. It's about 13,000 tons per year for an organization of 60 million euros. I would say it's in no way different than other businesses. Now, what was interesting is we did also an extrapolation for 220. And what we saw in 220, without going into details, is that despite the COVID pandemic and a reduction by half of the air travel footprint, actually emissions increased for Halima. And why was that? It was because basically there was an expansion of activities, of medical activities to respond to the COVID crisis, among others. And this led to a significant increase up to 14,500 tons per year. And I would say this is a key lesson, is that the footprint of dynamic aid organizations is actually constantly growing, because it's in link with activity. So if nothing was done, if we were to follow a business as usual scenario, well, emissions would likely grow all the time, while the climate crisis would be deepening every year. Now, with Halima, and through a very, I would say, participative process, workshops, etc., we selected a number of key solutions, 20 in the case of Halima, corresponding to the different emission sources, addressing both the carbon footprint challenge, but also local environmental degradation, like waste, plastics, water, etc. And we basically went in detail for each of these solutions to actually identify targets, quantifiable targets, with their expected impact on CO2 emissions in 2024, in 2027, and 2030. And we went as far as going to, into indicators, type of data, but also simply descriptive sheets of solutions and actions to inspire the field staff on what can be done in this regard. So this is just an example. Now, more importantly, with this set of solutions, we modelized what could be a trajectory over the next decade towards decarbonization. And what you see is the result of this work. It's a graph where the black line on the top represents carbon emissions. And so you see the baseline in 2019 to 20, and then what we call a business as usual scenario, which takes into account the growth of the organization. And for Alima, it's actually quite significant, the expectation over the next decade. And this is where we see in a business as usual scenario, emissions would constantly grow. Now, what you have below this line is all the different levers and their contribution to the reduction of carbon emissions to actually reverse the curve and reach the intended target, which is minus 50% from the 2020 baseline. And you see the contribution of each key solution. And obviously, the more the organization grows over the future, the more the carbon intensity will have to reduce over the next decade to reach the target. Now, what was very striking in the work we did is that we found out after the assessments and modelization that actually more than 85% of the carbon reduction over the next 10 years came from 5 major solutions. So it's actually I mean, although there were 20 identified and that had already been filtered down, I mean, 5 made 85% of the impact. And I think for aid organizations which have really hard choices to do on an everyday basis between, you know, I would say the energy that their social mission goals require from them and the means they have, it's important to concentrate effort where it really matters. So in the case of Alima, as an emergency medical organization, 5 solutions. Well, switching radically, you know, the air freight to maritime freight for supplies, much more than they were doing until now. It's also rationalizing staff travel, not a surprise, especially by air, but it's not only by air, it's also by road. It's increasing the energy efficiency of vehicles, whether it's linked to weight, engines, fuels, etc. But there's a clear lever on this side. Very importantly, and maybe more strategic on the long term, it's the importance of integrating precise environmental criteria to guide purchasing decisions, whether it's for goods and services. Of course, it has to be adapted to the different categories of goods that a specific organization uses. But this is, I would say, a very big key to the reduction of footprint. And finally, a very clear switch to renewable energy to produce energy in the field where there's no electricity grid. And this means mainly solar energy. And here there's a very big question to how to basically do this switch, deploy much faster, and integrate also the technical partnerships or the internal technical capacity to do it. Now, in this roadmap, we looked at the means for success. What does it take to actually succeed? So it obviously takes leadership very, very strongly strategic level, management level, and human, I would say, human competence and skills upgrading is probably the biggest key to success. And this means training. It means, in certain cases, um, getting, I would say, new positions to support the process of implementation, or it means distributing responsibilities a bit differently. Here, what you see is the case of Alima. It could be different for another organization. What was very instructive was the analysis of costs that we did over the first 3 years of implementation. So it's not the full period, but it's a first indication. And for an organization of about 60 million euros budget, what we saw is that the investments were likely around a bit more than 3 million, basically. But the savings were actually a little higher, 3.4 million euros over the period of 3 years, which tends to show somewhere between financial neutrality towards actually savings. Okay, so this is very, very instructive, because it shows that it's a lot about reallocation of means, of financial resources within the organization, more than actually pure additional costs. Now, this is not necessarily true for every organization, every actor. It's too early to come to generic conclusions, but it is, I would say, a relatively it's a good incentive. It's a good incentive to act, and it also corroborates conclusions of both private companies, but also public institutions like the National Health Service in the UK, which is very far in this process, that tend to come to the same type of conclusions. Okay, so it really goes against the myth that this is going to be unaffordable. So the roadmap is one thing, implementation is another. And now that it's behind, the roadmap building is behind us for Alima, we get into the priority setting for implementation. So just for information, in 2022 with Alima, we're working on a number of basically deliverables, which are a first set of deliverables and which will then be completed in 2023, 2024. And it comes from monitoring systems to actually procurement guidelines, and travel policies, etc., etc. So addressing in priority the 5 key solutions that have the biggest impact, and other aspects too. And Alima is also with us, going to organize a number of events in Western and Central Africa with their operational partners, to basically both share, consult, and see how they can be part of the picture in the rollout of this roadmap. So what are the key learnings if we summarize? Maybe first key learning is that, well, aid organizations have internal levers that are significant. And that can be turned into action. So there is a lot that's actionable. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean there's no work to do. There's a lot of work to do further down the chain to make it happen. But we see where the actions need to take place and what can be done. And what was interesting here is to see that what we call the structural effects, which come from more the macro level, so the national energy mix, for example, or progress in aviation emissions, etc. They play a part, and we can expect a certain level of improvement over the next few years, but they play actually a minority part in the reduction of the footprint of an organization. So that's a first very key lesson. Second is, well, the importance of focusing on a few solutions with the greatest impact to avoid, dispersion of energy. And I think what counts is for every aid organization to get the combination right, and focus very heavily where impacts are expected. And this means, of course, including what we call scope 3 emissions, which is all the supply chain, whether it's upstream and downstream. Leadership and investment, absolutely key. What we find in many organizations is often relatively isolated sustainability officers or technical people which are trying to carry out pilot projects, with some with great success, others less, but they do feel a bit isolated within their house, and what they need is very strong, I would say, commitment and leadership from the top here. So, and that's why with the Climate Action Accelerator, we start with a negotiation at the top level of the organization to basically start with the strategic commitments and then roll out the roadmap building. Third, well, you need quantified indicators and intermediary milestones. I mean, it's not good enough to simply, have general objectives or intentions. It's important to quantify. I mean, the battle for global warming is about quantities of CO2 emissions and how you get them down. And so it's critical to get this in the mobilization. It's also motivating for people. Fifth, well, avoided costs can actually compensate for a large part of the investments. Probably depending on the organization, they can compensate them totally or actually not totally. And this has to be seen case by case. And finally, a roadmap is about an adaptive strategy. So it needs continuous learning, continuous adjustment, and it means providing space for this to happen over the years. Now, I have a few last slides on beyond, I would say, the work with individual aid organizations. What can be done to actually amplify the transformation in the aid sector? So today we're working very closely with ICRC, we're working closely with NSF, with Terre des Hommes, with others. And over the next, I would say by the end of the year, and especially 2023, we will be able to extract, from this experience, but also from others' experience, a number of, I would say, lessons that can help to actually accelerate the transformation in the aid sector. So how does this look like? And so it starts with basically mobilizing more aid organizations around this goal, and getting more commitments, because without these commitments, there's very little happens. And that's the main lesson of the last years. It's important to have national NGOs included in this dynamic, but also with a differentiated approach, because obviously in developing and low resource countries especially, it's more about how to ensure a low carbon development model, which is resilient, which combines also adaptation and resilience, and allows to also have an adapted pathway. Second is mutualized operational support. So and this is what we do when working with the key organizations I mentioned before. So it's the co-constructed roadmaps, but it's also providing, I would say, added value in the implementation of projects
Sorry, there must be something going on with Bruno's connection, but he'll be back.
Sorry, do you hear me?
Yeah, but we cannot see your screen anymore.
Okay, sorry. Do you see my screen now?
Yeah, now it's fine.
Did I just lose it or had I lost it for some time?
You lost it for like 2 minutes.
Okay. So I was on basically the tools to accelerate sector-wide transformation. So which are they? We've identified the need for an inventory and a repository of solutions and actions which are generic and which can help all organizations. Collaborating notably with the ICRC and a number of other NGOs on the delivery and especially the support to a carbon measurement tool, which is adapted to the aid sector. And this is linked to notably the pilot of the carbon accounting tool, which is currently in preparation under the auspices of the ICRC. An emissions factors database, which can feed into this carbon tool, which is important because emission factors have to be, I would say, more precise and adapted to the specific context and type of supplies that aid organizations use. And this is a project that we would like to deliver in 2023. And finally, and probably, I mean, very important, more for the sector-wide transformation, it's to extract lessons from the 2 first years and work collectively towards a generic roadmap, which could be published and distributed by the second semester 2023. Beyond this, other areas of amplification is, well, an open source platform for a community of sharing. So this platform is in the final stages now of preparation. We hope that it will come online end of May or beginning of June. And it will be progressively enriched with, I would say, more and more material that's useful to aid organizations in their action. And finally, extract again from lessons learned what can be training content that can be used by others, but also establishing a strategic dialogue, notably with funders and states, to influence donor policy where it needs to be, and in order to create the facilitating environment that also many NGOs that are dependent on public funds need to accelerate their own transformation. And with this, I'll stop. Thanks for your attention, and happy to take comments, questions, input. Please go ahead.
We have already, Bruno, some questions in the chat. They're asking about investments. When you talk about investments being 3.1 million euros, are these one-off initial investments or staggered over the period of time of planned transition reduction? It's Caroline Millet who's asking.
Yeah, so we have to remember this is for a particular case. It's the case of Alima over the first 3 years. So indeed, the investments were estimated at about 3 million for 3 years, so about 1 million per year. And this covers essentially investment in renewable energy equipment, but also investment in human capacity, so trainings, human resources, and also in, I would say, additional costs linked to procurement over the first few years, okay? So this is what was done, and in the savings, what you will find is essentially savings from transport, mainly, so both air freight and travel, but again, this has to be it has to be seen organization by organization. Maybe I'll stop sharing my slide so that we can see each other.
Okay. Here's another question. How did Alima approach measuring savings and expenditures in carbon footprint and reporting to act on it? They're asking about processes, tools, other.
So, sorry, I'm not sure I fully understood this question. Can you repeat it?
Yeah, they said, how did Alima approach measuring savings and expenditures in carbon footprint and reporting to act on it? Processes, tools, other.
Yeah. So well, I just talked before about investments and savings. So it's actually the accelerator, the Climate Action Accelerator, who, with the data of Alima, did this modelization. So it's a first modelization exercise. And we're currently basically refining this modelization for the next wave of organizations we're currently working with. And we're happy to share more details when it's ready. If we can, we will. When we come to a robust enough model of costs, our intention is to share it in open source.
Okay. They ask also if the Climate Action Accelerator assists other humanitarian organizations to do a similar roadmap as Alima.
Yes, so absolutely. So the Climate Action Accelerator is an open initiative. So aid organizations that are interested to join are welcome to contact us. What does joining mean? It means both entering into a discussion around commitments, which are very important to come on board. And it means also agreeing on basically, a work program of priorities. It also means contributing to the initiative in different ways. So what I would advise to organizations who are interested is definitely to contact us after this webinar. We'll be happy to liaise. And this initiative, I also want to pass a key message. This initiative is about reaching a critical mass of organization to accelerate the transformation. So we're really happy to have more join.
Okay, thank you. Someone asked also about the carbon accounting tool from the ICRC, and they're asking when will it be ready?
So to our knowledge, as I would say we're among the participants to the carbon accounting tool process, of which actually many NGOs are part. There's dozens of NGOs which are following its development. So it's led by RCRC with the support of a consultancy which is called EcoAct. And in the current plan, the pilots are about to start around mid-year in the second semester. Towards October, November, then to readjust the tool based on lessons, and to make it then available to the community of aid organizations after that.
Okay. Someone asked also, on the basis of the Alima case study, do you have an idea of the investment needed to meet the 50% reduction goal? It would be good if you had a figure that expresses the cost in dollars or euros per ton CO2.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. Of course, it would be very nice to have precisely, the cost per ton of CO2 until 2030. The reality is that the further the period is, away, the more uncertainty there is about the figures. So that's why we've chosen to concentrate until now on the first years of implementation, which is the first 3 years. But as we, I would say, deepen our cost analysis, we will try to look into masses, financial masses involved further down the line in the decade. For the moment, it remains hazardous to go until 2030, especially with aspects like inflation, prices, etc., etc. So what we believe is, until now, most management teams have a planning horizon of 3 to 4 years in front of them, sometimes a bit more. So that's where they actually need the cost analysis, and most organizations need orientations for the periods after. But it's a challenge, it's a good question, and we will try to go further in the coming times.
2 more people asked 2 questions. I don't know if you want to turn on your mics and maybe ask the question. They're a bit longer than the others. So feel free to unmute and you can ask the questions yourselves. Well, otherwise, I think I can read out loud the question. So, have the community of 8 organizations you are working with considered joined up solutions and overlaps as part of the roadmaps? Is the focus of the community on primarily learning from each other, or is there active collaboration too?
Okay, so do you hear me well? Because I have a small connection problem. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, now we hear you.
Okay, so have 8 organizations, have the community of 8 organizations you are working with considered joining up solutions and roadmaps, etc.? Well, I think that's very much the work we're doing at the moment, is actually by working in parallel on the roadmaps of different organizations with each their specificities. What we see is a lot of, I would say, generic knowledge and lessons to be shared. And our role is specifically to make them available progressively on our platform and through the work we do with them. So this is the open source concept. And of course, each organization has always specificities that we can learn from for others. Some are more active in food, others are more active in shelter, others, of course, are medical actors, etc., etc. And so there's a lot to learn and share each time with each specific organization. And but it is really the focus of this initiative to, I would say, to have economies of scale, both on the learning side and but also on trying to beef up the speed of the process. As time goes by, we hope to be able to speed up each time the time it takes to deliver these roadmaps and work with the organizations. And finally, if I want to add something, there will be a number of working groups we want to set up precisely for sharing between partners on, I would say, focused topics with high added value for their work.
Okay, we had a question regarding donors' positions on this initiative as a whole and/or on the specific case of implementers who are funding the roadmaps and transforming their organizations?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, you have to know that our initiative is funded by both partner organizations that contribute to the initiative and basically adopt this approach of mutualization to get support and sharing, etc. But we're also supported by with public institutional funds, and we've had first support since already last year, and we are in the process of increasing this mobilization of public funds from different state agencies or the European Union, etc. And we are also mobilizing private foundations to support this dynamic. Okay, so the idea is really to have a balanced approach to funding when it comes to the initiative. And can organizations have their own efforts and roadmaps funded? Well, the good news with the work we did with Alima is that almost in the first year of roadmap building and then project planning, they managed to cover most of their costs, if not all. And so there is definitely openness today on this ambition. And I think it's also going to be part of the institutional dialogue with policy makers to see how they can facilitate here and there their requirements to make it happen. And it goes with review of indicators, review of rules, etc. Because notably some investments, especially in renewable energy, require capital first, and the question is how to to integrate this when actually the return on the investment comes a bit later.
Okay, we have two other questions. One of them refers to the type of savings of implementing the roadmap, I guess. And also another one related to the costs of the nature of the costs of procurement that you mentioned. So they want to know what type of tool, external advice, recruitment, training related to costs in terms of procurement.
Yeah, so when it comes to the costs of procurement, so this is the area where I would say the financial estimation is probably with the greatest uncertainty, for one very good reason, is that as long as you don't define precisely the criteria you're going to use in your procurement, it's very hard to modelize costs. And this is very specific to the activities of each organization. So procurement for education is not the same as for medical, which is not the same as for food or shelter, etc. So here, what's needed for procurement is actually to deliver a number of projects in the implementation phase, which allow to define, precisely for each categories of items what criteria are going to be used. So in the absence of these criteria already determined by the organization, what you use is, I would say, numbers from experiences in other types of organizations that have gone through these processes. And it often leads to a limited overcost, but I wouldn't, again, I'd be very careful before going to any generic conclusions. Also, what's important to say is that the market evolves a lot and will evolve a lot in the next decade, because there's a lot of policy push to implement carbon emission reductions, etc. And on procurement, there's a lot of work to be done on the key items that make out most of the procurement. In many organizations, the top 10 or 20 items make out 50% or 60 or 80% of the procurement. So you can have a very focused approach. And then it's also about supplier engagement. It's also about choosing which suppliers you want to work with, and looking at their own commitments as organizations. So there'll be actually a webinar that we organize in 2 weeks from now, I think on the 16th and 17th of May, precisely on procurement and travel, and to which our solutions team will contribute
to. Thank you. Another question is whether Halima used carbon budgets to trigger behavior in reducing carbon footprint or another method.
So no, so in Halima's roadmap, there's no carbon budget attributed, to departments, services, or countries. It's not that way that it was done. It's been really more a work on, key solutions and where are the key responsibilities for implementing them, and giving quantified targets on these solutions with with responsibilities established in the organization. And so that's the way it's been done. But we found, and it doesn't mean it's true for every organization, but for Halima, which is an emergency organization, we didn't find it necessarily appropriate in this phase to go for carbon budgets, because by definition, they have to be very agile, very flexible, whether it's on the supply chain or countries, etc. And you can't just have an absolute limitation like this. But I think it will be important for other type organizations to indeed experiment the carbon budget methods, and we're interested in actually doing pilots on this.
I don't know if there's any reaction to Bruno's answers or another questions that you would like to ask. Please feel free to take the floor. We have still a few minutes left. Just remember to unmute yourself. The type of savings they're asking.
Yeah. So what are the type of savings that happen? In the case of Halima, the main origin of savings was on transport. So on notably the switch from air freight to maritime freight on one hand, which in the case of Halima, is a very significant potential. And the second is obviously on air travel, but it's also on return on investment, for example, on generators, fuel generators when they're replaced by solar energy after the investment phase is covered. So there are a number of here are where the main savings are. Again, for other organizations, it might be different. It's a bit too early to make conclusions.
Thank you. Someone asked, how can we be sure that the 50% reduction target can be achieved without damaging the organization's activities?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So in the selection of solutions and actions, we were very careful to identify criteria through which they would have to go through, and one of these criteria is the impact on social mission, so basically on assistance capacity for populations, whether it's in terms of quantity and quality. And any solution which basically went against the capacity to deliver assistance, both quantity or quality, was put aside. So what we end up with is solutions that are, that basically either support the strengthening of assistance goals, or it depends on conditions of success to put in place to make sure they don't hamper the assistance. Okay, but I think on this regard, what Alima's roadmap shows is that you can actually go very far. You can actually go very far in reduction of emissions before touching, any assistance activities. And then probably further down the lane, later, when an organization is more mature, they can integrate, reflections on their operational model, while still developing the assistance, but maybe, organizational models have a role to play.
We have two more questions, Bruno. One of them is about the linearity of the reduction trajectory of Halima. They're asking what was the approach to the multi-year projection of reducing the carbon footprint? Because it has to be adaptive, it's not necessarily linear. So.
Yeah, again, very good question, very relevant. So a trajectory indeed, is linear by simplification, but actually that's not what happens in reality, because depending on the rollout of some investments, first you can have increases of emissions linked to investments. For example, solar energy, the year you buy, the panels, etc., you can actually increase emissions and get returns only later. So what you will have is actually zigzags, but leading towards reduction, and it will be by stages, and it will depend on the implementation timeline by the organization and the means they actually develop for this. So very wise and legitimate question.
And I guess this one will be our last question. So they're asking when our platform of solutions and the emission factors database will be ready.
So we're working hard to get this platform online by the end of the month or beginning of June. And it's in, I would say, it's in the final stages, because it's a project that has been going on for a few months, and then the content will. You should see it, and you will be informed of its launch when it's out. We'll basically distribute it to the contact list, etc. And it will be enriched progressively, which means that the initial content will not be all the content, and it will be the start of basically an online sharing strategy with more and more documents and tools progressively.
Well, I think this is a wrap up for today. People are saying very interesting presentation and many thanks. Thank you to everyone who assisted this webinar. And please, you can also find information about us in our website, climateactionaccelerator.org, or in our social media, LinkedIn, Climate Action Accelerator, and Instagram as well.
Oh, great. So thanks a lot to all of you, and you're very welcome to contact us by mail whenever you want. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.